This isn't just a story. It's the raw truth of how I spent 50 years haunted by a betrayal that stole everything, only to finally reclaim it. The day Silas Thorne walked onto my family's land, my grandfather's land, with that sickening smile and stack of papers, my world began to crumble. He swore he was helping, a savior in a bespoke suit, but his every word was a poison, slowly, meticulously destroying generations of my family's legacy, leaving us with nothing but the dust beneath our feet. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel. Tell us where you're from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. My earliest memory isn't a sound or a face, but a smell. The rich, loamy earth of the Finch homestead, after a spring rain, mingled with the sweet, musky scent of ripening heirloom tobacco. It was a scent of life, of generations rooted deep in the red Kentucky soil of Oak Haven Creek. Our farm wasn't just land. It was a living, breathing entity, a character in our family story, passed down from my great-grandfather, a man who staked his claim in the rugged beauty of this region and poured his sweat into making it flourish. I was Kalen Finch, and from the moment I could walk, every fiber of my being was intertwined with that land. The rolling hills, the ancient oak trees that marked our boundaries, the winding creek that fed our fields. It was all a part of me. Our tobacco wasn't just any tobacco. It was a heritage strain, cultivated with methods passed down through whispered advice and callous hands. It was revered, sought after by specialty buyers, and it was our pride. We weren't rich in coin, but we were rich in tradition, in purpose, in the quiet dignity of honest work. My father, a man of few words but immense strength, taught me everything. He showed me how to read the clouds for rain, how to listen to the whisper of the wind through the tall stalks, how to mend a fence post with an almost spiritual reverence for the wood. He taught me that the land gives as much as you give it, and never to take more than you need. I absorbed it all, eager to carry on a legacy, to be the next link in the chain. When I met Reese, she was a breath of fresh air in the humid Kentucky summers. She wasn't from a farming family, but she understood the heart of it, the quiet rhythms and the deep connections. Her laughter was like wind chimes, and her presence brought a warmth that softened the edges of my sometimes stoic farmer's life. We married under the same ancient oak that had witnessed generations of Finch weddings, and within a few years our daughter, Elara, arrived, a bright-eyed, curious sprite who quickly became the sunshine of our lives. Watching Elara chase butterflies through the tobacco fields, her tiny hands reaching for the sun-drenched leaves, was a joy that eclipsed any hardship. I imagined her, one day, taking over, just as my father before me. The future felt as fertile and boundless as our fields. Life on the Finch homestead wasn't without its struggles, of course. Farming is a gamble against nature, against markets, against forces far beyond your control. But we always pulled through together. We had community. 2. Oak Haven Creek was a small town, built on trust and mutual aid. If a barn needed raising, neighbors showed up. If a family fell on hard times, a casserole would appear on their doorstep. We believed in each other. We believed in the goodness of our people. Then the cracks began to show. It started subtly, a barely perceptible shift in the weather patterns. The spring rains, once dependable, became erratic. Summers grew hotter, longer, the sun a relentless hammer pounding our fields. The creek, usually robust, dwindled to a trickle in places. Our heirloom tobacco, known for its resilience, began to suffer. The leaves were smaller, the yields lower, the quality diminished. We fought it with every ounce of ingenuity and strength we possessed. We dug deeper wells. We experimented with new irrigation techniques. We prayed to a God we felt would slowly turn his back on us. The financial strain was a dull ache that grew sharper with each passing season. Savings, carefully accumulated over years, began to dwindle. Loans once easily repaid became a heavy burden. I spent sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, the scent of damp earth now replaced by the metallic tang of worry. Reese, ever the optimist, tried to reassure me, but I could see the lines of concern etching themselves around her beautiful eyes. Elara, still too young to fully grasp the gravity of our situation, would sometimes ask why Daddy was always so tired, why the laughter in the house felt a little thinner. Our pride, The very thing that sustained us prevented me from asking for help from our neighbors. I felt it was my burden to bear, my failure to rectify. My father's words, "The land gives as much as you give it," echoed in my mind, mocking me. Had I not given enough? Had I somehow betrayed the trust of the soil? It was in the midst of this deepening despair that Silas Thorne appeared. He wasn't from Oakhaven Creek, not originally. He'd moved to a larger town nearby a few years prior, a slick, self-made man who seemed to ooze success from every pore. He owned a regional development company, specializing in, as he put it, revitalizing rural economies. He drove a gleaming black sedan, wore suits that cost more than my entire year's harvest, and spoke with a smooth, almost hypnotic cadence. Silas first approached me at the annual Oakhaven Creek Harvest Festival. I was trying to offload a meager harvest, feeling the shame burn in my cheeks. He introduced himself, extending a manicured hand, his smile wide and disarmingly friendly. He spoke of his deep admiration for traditional farming, for family legacies, for salt-of-the-earth people like us. He knew about the struggles, he said. He'd heard whispers of the drought's impact. He understood. He empathized. He was there to help. He talked about a new initiative, a partnership program for struggling farms, offering substantial loans at what he called community-minded rates. He painted a picture of a future where Finch Homestead could not only survive but thrive, diversified with new crops, perhaps even a small tourism venture. He spoke of safeguarding our legacy, of honoring my ancestors. He was a master manipulator, weaving a narrative of hope and salvation when I was drowning in despair. Reese was wary. "He's too polished, Kalen," she whispered one evening, after Silas had spent an hour charming us on our porch. No one offers something for nothing. But I was desperate. I saw Alara's future slipping away, the land I loved turning to dust. Silas's offer felt like a lifeline, the only one extended. He presented reams of paperwork, thick legal documents filled with jargon I barely understood. He explained it all away with reassuring smiles and promises. Just standard procedure, Kalen. Protecting both our interests. It's a partnership, remember? The core of the deal was a substantial loan, enough to carry us through several bad seasons, to invest in new irrigation, to buy resilient seed. In return, Silas would hold a lien on the land, and in case of default, he would have the right to purchase the property at a predetermined, fair market price, which he assured me was generous. It seemed like a safety net, a temporary measure. We would pay him back, I was certain. We would work harder than ever. I signed. Reese, her hand trembling, signed too, her eyes meeting mine, full of the silent apprehension that I, in my blind hope, chose to ignore. The relief that flooded me was immense, intoxicating. For a few glorious weeks, it felt like the dark clouds had parted. We bought new equipment, invested in soil revitalization, and for the first time in a long time, the laughter in our home returned, full and rich. But Silas Thorne was no savior. He was a predator, and his trap was meticulously laid. The first subtle changes began a few months after the agreement. Silas started making suggestions about how we managed the farm. He questioned my traditional methods, insisted on certain chemical fertilizers that I knew would harm the soil in the long run, demanded detailed financial reports with increasing frequency. His calls became more urgent, his tone slightly less friendly, more authoritative. He sent over his own consultants, sharp-suited men who walked our field with clipboards and condescending expressions, pointing out every perceived inefficiency. Then came the adjustments. Minor clauses in the agreement, which Silas claimed were simply clarifications, began to surface. Suddenly, the interest rate on the loan seemed to fluctuate based on market conditions I couldn't control. The fair market price of the land in case of default was subtly reevaluated, tied to an index that seemed perpetually stagnant, ensuring the value never truly increased. Every time I questioned him, he'd turn on the charm, making me feel foolish for not understanding the complexities of modern finance. "Caleb, my friend," he'd purr, "you worry too much. We're partners, remember? I'm looking out for you." Reese, her intuition sharper than mine, saw it clearer. "He's tightening the noose, Kalen," she'd say, her voice low and filled with dread. He's not helping us. He's setting us up. I pushed back, refusing to believe the man who had offered us hope could be so malicious. I had to believe it, because the alternative, that I had endangered everything, was too devastating to contemplate. The final blow came with a cruel precision that could only be orchestrated. A freak hailstorm, unprecedented for that time of year, swept through Oak Haven Creek, decimating our young tobacco plants. Weeks of labor, months of hope, wiped out in a single, brutal hour. We were insured, of course, but Silas, through his lawyers, found a loophole. A clause in our agreement stated that certain catastrophic events not explicitly covered by a specific insurance rider, which he had conveniently not mentioned, would trigger an acceleration clause on our loan. Suddenly, the entire balance, plus exorbitant penalties, was due in 30 days. 30 days to pay back a loan that was meant to carry us for years. It was impossible. He knew it was impossible. Silas Thorne arrived on our porch a week later, not in his usual bespoke suit, but in a tailored blazer, almost as if trying to appear less formal, less like the executioner he was. He offered condolences for the storm, his eyes devoid of genuine sympathy. He held the foreclosure papers, legally binding, meticulously executed. The generous, predetermined price for our land barely covered the accelerated debt, leaving us with nothing, not a penny. I stood there, the papers in my trembling hands, the words blurring through a haze of disbelief and profound, gut-wrenching shame. The scent of the earth, once my comfort, now felt like an accusation. I had failed. I had allowed this viper into our home, into our lives, and he had poisoned everything. Reese stood beside me, her face pale, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. Elara, sensing the shift, clutched at Reese's skirt, her bright eyes wide with fear. Watching Silas Thorne walk away, a spring in his step, already planning what new development he'd put on our land, something inside me broke, and something else, something cold and hard, began to form. We were given 2 weeks to vacate. 2 weeks to pack a lifetime of memories, of dreams, of family history, into a few worn suitcases. 2 weeks to say goodbye to the only home we'd ever known. As we drove away from Finch Homestead, the old pickup truck laden with our meager belongings, I looked back. The fields, once vibrant with promise, lay bare and broken. The house, where Lara had taken her first steps, where Reese and I had shared our dreams, stood stark against the fading light, already looking abandoned. Silas Thorne's car was parked near the barn, his silhouette visible against the setting sun, surveying his new acquisition. My hand instinctively clenched around the steering wheel, knuckles white. The shame, the anger, the bitter taste of betrayal. It all coalesced into a single, burning vow. I didn't know how, I didn't know when, but I swore to myself, to my ancestors, to Reese and Alara, that I would reclaim what was ours. This wasn't the end. It was merely the beginning of a silence that would last for 50 years, a silence that only a reckoning could break. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel. Tell us where you're from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. The drive away from Finch Homestead was a blur of unshed tears and a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing down on us. Elara, only 5, kept asking, "Daddy, why is Mr. Thorne going to live in our house?" Her innocent confusion was a fresh wound with every question. Reese, her hand clasped tightly in mine, could only manage a choked sob. I couldn't look back. The image of Silas's silhouette, framed by the setting sun on my land, was seared into my mind, a brand of indignity and impotent rage. We ended up in Berea, a small college town about an hour and a half north of Oak Haven Creek. It was far enough to escape the immediate shame, but close enough that the scent of Kentucky hills still carried on the breeze, a constant, cruel reminder of what we lost. Our new home was a cramped, 2-bedroom rental, a stark contrast to the sprawling farmhouse that had been the heart of our family for generations. The air here didn't smell of rich earth and ripening tobacco. It smelled of stale carpet and the faint, unsettling odor of other people's lives. The first few years were a grinding, soul-crushing struggle. I was a farmer, through and through. My hands knew the rhythm of the soil, the weight of a healthy harvest, the delicate art of cultivation. Here, those skills were useless. I took whatever I could get: day labor on construction sites, stocking shelves at the local grocery store, even a brief, humiliating stint cleaning motel rooms. My pride, once rooted in the land, was now constantly trampled. Every blister, every aching muscle, every meager paycheck was a fresh reminder of Silas Thorne's treachery. Reese, bless her heart, was a rock. She found work as a teaching assistant at the local elementary school, a job she'd always secretly wanted, but never pursued because of our life on the farm. She made our little rental a home, filling it with the scent of her cooking and the quiet strength of her presence. But I could see the toll it took on her. The spark in her eyes, once so bright, had dimmed, replaced by a quiet weariness. Ilara, resilient as only a child can be, adapted. She made friends, learned to ride her bike on paved streets instead of dirt paths. But sometimes, when she thought I wasn't listening, I'd hear her drawing pictures of a big house with green fields, and my heart would ache with a grief that felt too vast bare. The vow I'd made, that desperate whisper in the truck, began to solidify. It wasn't just a fleeting thought. It was a deep, burning ember in my gut. Every piece of news that filtered back from Oak Haven Creek fanned its flames. Silas Thorne didn't let the Finch homestead remain a farm. No, that would have been too simple. He leveled the ancient oak that had witnessed our weddings, paved over tobacco fields, and erected a sprawling industrial park. Warehouses and distribution centers, bland, soulless concrete structures, now stood where generations of my family had poured their sweat and dreams. He renamed it the Thorne Business Campus. The desecration was complete. He didn't just take our land. He erased our very memory from it. That's when the whisper became a vow, etched into the very core of my being. Asterisk, I will make him pay. I will reclaim what he stole, not just the land, but the dignity, the legacy, the future he extinguished. Asterisk. But how? I was a farmer, not a lawyer, not a businessman. Silas Thorne operated in a world of high finance, legal loopholes, and ruthless ambition, a world utterly foreign to me. I knew then that I couldn't confront him as Kalen Finch, the ruined farmer. I had to become something else entirely. I had to learn his language, understand his battlefield. The realization hit me one sweltering summer evening after a particularly brutal shift on a construction site. My hands were raw, my back screaming, and I felt utterly defeated. I looked at Reese, stirring a meager dinner on our tiny stove, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion, and at Ilara, quietly doing her homework at the kitchen table. This wasn't the life I'd promised them. This wasn't the legacy I was supposed to provide. That night, something shifted. The despair didn't vanish, but it was overshadowed by a cold, calculating resolve. I couldn't afford to be just a victim anymore. I had to become a student. My education began in the Berea Public Library. After my shifts, while Reese and Ilara were asleep, I'd pore over books. Not novels or histories, but business textbooks, legal tomes, financial reports. I read about corporate structures, property law, investment strategies, market manipulation. I sought out articles about Silas Thorne's company, Thorne Development Group. I studied his methods, his acquisitions, his public statements. I learned about shell corporations' eminent domain abuses, zoning laws, and the dark underbelly of regional development. Each page I turned, each concept I grasped, felt like a small victory, a tiny chip in the mountain of ignorance that separated me from my enemy. It was a slow, arduous process. My mind, trained to read the land, now had to grapple with the abstract complexities of finance and law. There were nights I wanted to give up, nights the sheer impossibility of it all threatened to crush me. But then I'd close my eyes and see the industrial park on our land, hear Ilara's innocent questions, feel Reese's quiet fatigue, and the fire would reignite. After about 5 years in Berea, I knew I needed to expand my horizons. Berea was too small, too insulated. Silas Thorne operated on a larger stage, and I needed to understand that stage. We made the difficult decision to move again, this time to Louisville, a sprawling city with more opportunities, more anonymity, and, crucially, a more complex economic landscape. Louisville was a shock to the system. The noise, the traffic, the endless concrete canyons. It was a world away from the quiet rhythms of Oak Haven Creek. but it offered something Berea couldn't, a chance to truly transform. I continued to work odd jobs, but I also started taking evening classes at a community college, focusing on business administration and economics. It wasn't a degree, but it gave me a foundational understanding, a vocabulary to articulate the theories I was devouring in the library. Reese found work in the city's burgeoning healthcare sector, quickly proving her aptitude for organization and empathy. Ilara, now a teenager, navigated high school with a quiet strength that mirrored her mother's. She excelled in her studies, her intelligence a bright spot in our often gloomy existence. She knew we'd lost a farm, understood the hardship, but I kept the true depth of my obsession hidden from her. It was a burden I would carry alone. Reese, though, knew. She saw the stacks of books, the late nights, the fierce, unyielding glint in my eyes. She never voiced her fears directly, but her quiet questions, her gentle touches, spoke volumes. She worried for my soul, for the man I was becoming. But she also understood the wound, the betrayal, and in her own way, she supported my silent war. Over the next 2 decades, I meticulously rebuilt myself. I started in entry-level sales, a world completely alien to my farmer sensibilities. It was a baptism by fire, learning to read people, to negotiate, to understand desire and leverage. I failed, I stumbled, but I always learned. I moved from sales to low-level management in a logistics company, then to operations, gradually climbing the ladder. I wasn't a prodigy, but I was relentless, driven by a purpose far beyond a mere paycheck. I observed the inner workings of corporate America, the backroom deals, the subtle power plays, the legal maneuvering that could make or break a company. I learned to speak the language of profit and loss, of assets and liabilities, of mergers and acquisitions. I learned to see the world not as a farmer sees a land, but as a predator sees its prey. I saved every penny, lived frugally, and began to make small, calculated investments. I wasn't looking for quick riches, but for stable, incremental growth. My goal wasn't just to get rich. It was to build a war chest, a financial arsenal that could stand against Silas Thorne's empire. I studied the stock market, real estate trends, and commodity prices with the same intensity one once studied weather patterns. Meanwhile, Silas Thorne's influence continued to expand. He wasn't just a regional developer anymore. Thorne Development Group had become a multi-state entity, with projects in Tennessee, Ohio, and even parts of North Carolina. His name was synonymous with ruthless efficiency and aggressive expansion. He was lauded in business magazines as a visionary, a titan of industry. The irony was a bitter pill, but also fueled my resolve. The bigger he got, the harder he would fall. Ilara grew up, went to college, studied law. She was brilliant, compassionate, everything I hoped she would be. She married a good man, a kind architect named Arlo, and they had 2 children, my grandchildren, a boy named Finn and a girl named Solara. Watching them, seeing the joy and innocence in their lives, solidified my purpose even further. This wasn't just about me or Reese or even my ancestors. It was about protecting their future, ensuring no one like Silas Thorne could ever again destroy a family's legacy with impunity. Reese, now in her 60s, had retired. She still held a quiet concern for my relentless pursuit, but over the years, she'd come to accept it as part of who I was. She knew I couldn't let it go, and she understood why. She was my anchor, my connection to the life we'd lost, and the reason I still had a heart beneath the hardened shell I'd built. 50 years, half a century. My hair had turned gray, then white. The calluses on my hands, once from honest labor, were now from gripping a pen, a keyboard, or a steering wheel. The naive farmer who signed those papers was long gone, replaced by a man who understood the intricate, often brutal, dance of power and money. I was still Kalen Finch, but I was also someone else entirely. I had learned to play the game, and I had learned it from the best, or rather, the worst. I had built a comfortable life for Reese and Ilara's family, a testament to my tireless work. But my personal wealth, the war chest I had meticulously cultivated, was substantial. More importantly, I had accumulated a vast network of contacts, some unwitting, some genuinely helpful, and a staggering amount of intelligence on Thorne Development Group. I knew their vulnerabilities, their legal weak spots, the skeletons hidden in their corporate closets. I had studied their acquisitions, their balance sheets, even the personal habits of Silas Thorne and his inner circle. The silence I had maintained for 50 years was about to break. I was ready. The catalyst came in the form of a small, discreet news article in a regional business journal. Thorne Development Group was making a significant push into a new sector, sustainable energy. They were acquiring vast tracts of land, particularly in rural, economically depressed areas, under the guise of building solar farms and wind turbines. The article mentioned a new flagship project, a massive solar installation plan for the fertile farmlands of eastern Kentucky, near Oak Haven Creek. My old heart, which had been a slow-burning ember, suddenly roared into a full-blown inferno. He wasn't just building on our land. He was expanding, threatening other families, other legacies, with the same predatory tactics. He was going to replicate his destruction. I looked at the article, then at the meticulously organized files spread across my desk. Decades of research, of planning, of waiting. 50 years. The time had come. Silas Thorne was about to find out that a farmer, stripped his land, could become a force more relentless than any drought, more enduring than any storm. He was about to discover that the quiet man he'd ruined had been watching, learning, and preparing. He was about to learn that some seeds, once planted, would eventually bear a bitter harvest. I picked up the phone, my fingers, though aged, steady and sure. The first call in a very long time, to an old contact I cultivated over the years, a man whose reputation for discretion and ruthlessness was almost as legendary as his legal mind. "It's Kalen Finch," I said, my voice low, gravelly with age but firm with intent. "I believe it's time we discuss a certain Thorne business campus and its proprietor." The silence was over. The war had begun. The phone call was like uncorking a bottle that had been sealed for 50 years. The air, thick with anticipation, crackled around me. "It's Kalen Finch," I repeated, my voice steady, though a tremor of something primal, long suppressed, ran through me. "I believe it's time we discussed a certain Thorne business campus and its proprietor." A pause on the other end, long enough for me to hear the subtle shift in breathing. Then a voice, deep and resonant, a voice I hadn't heard in person in decades, though I'd followed its career trajectory with keen interest. "Kalen, it's been a very long time." I almost didn't recognize the number. Lysander Croft. His name alone evoked a certain gravitas in legal circles. He was a man who didn't chase headlines but dominated courtrooms, a strategist renowned for dismantling corporate empires, often with quiet, surgical precision. I'd cultivated him through a mutual acquaintance years ago, a man who unknowingly helped me build my network while thinking he was helping me invest. Lysander had always been a contact, someone I'd occasionally sent minor, legitimate business his way, keeping him in the loop, waiting for this moment. 50 years, Lysander, I confirmed, leaning back in my leather office chair, the hum of the city outside my window a distant counterpoint to the storm brewing within me. And in that time, I've done nothing but prepare for this conversation. He chuckled, a dry, knowing sound. "I always suspected you had a longer game in mind, Kalen. Your initial queries, your interest in specific types of corporate malfeasance, it always felt like more than just academic curiosity." Lysander was sharper than most. He'd seen the subtle threads I'd been weaving. "So, Silas Thorne, you're ready to move?" "More than ready," I said, the words burning with decades of suppressed fury. "I have everything you'll need. Every document, every loophole, every public and private transgression. 50 years of meticulous observation. I know his empire better than he does, and I know exactly where the cracks are." "Send it all," Lysander instructed, his voice now devoid of any casualness, replaced by the crisp, focused tone of a general surveying the battlefield, digitally, securely. "And then, Kalen, meet me in my office next Tuesday. Noon. We'll map out the war." The week that followed was a whirlwind of activity. I had spent years digitizing, categorizing, cross-referencing every shred of information I'd gathered. Now, I uploaded it all to a secure server, a veritable mountain of data, Land deeds, zoning variances, loan documents, financial statements, email archives, personnel reports, environmental impact assessments. It was a mosaic of deceit, meticulously assembled piece by painstaking piece. This wasn't just about Silas Thorne taking my land. It was about the pattern of his operations, the systemic exploitation of vulnerable communities, the legal acrobatics he performed to skirt regulations, the quiet corruption that enabled his ascent. On Tuesday, as I walked into Lysander Croft's pristine downtown Louisville office, I felt a strange blend of exhilaration and solemnity. The waiting room was hushed, opulent, a world away from the dusty fields of my youth. Lysander, a man whose silver hair and sharp blue eyes belied an almost terrifying intellect, greeted me with a firm handshake. He led me into a cavernous conference room, where a large monitor displayed a complex web of interconnected diagrams, corporate structures, and financial flows. My data visualized. Impressive, Kalen. Truly, Lysander said, gesturing to the screen. I've gone through a fraction of what you provided, and I'm already seeing a dozen angles of attack. You haven't just repaired, you've built a fortress of evidence. He built his empire on quicksand, Lysander. I just mapped the fault lines. My voice was devoid of emotion, a practiced neutrality I'd honed over decades. We spent the next 6 hours in that room. I laid out the history, the personal narrative, the slow strangulation of my family's farm. But then I transitioned into the cold, hard facts, the predatory lending practices, the questionable environmental waivers, the undervalued land acquisitions, the shell corporations used to obscure ownership and liability, the quiet donations to local politicians, the regulatory bodies whose eyes were conveniently elsewhere. I even had evidence of several instances where Thorne Development Group had leveraged local economic desperation to push through projects that were ultimately detrimental to the long-term health of the communities they claimed to revitalize. Lysander listened, his expression unreadable, occasionally scribbling notes, asking incisive questions that cut straight to the heart of the matter. He was building his case, piece by piece, brick by brick. The solar farm project near Oakhaven Creek, I finally said, pointing to a section of the digital map highlighting the new acquisitions. That's our entry point. It's his most recent, most ambitious project in the region. He's overextended, relying on a complex web of tax incentives and federal grants. And the land acquisitions, some of them bear the hallmarks of the same tactics he used on my family. Lysander nodded slowly. A fresh wound, easier to exploit, and the emotional resonance that's powerful, Kalen. The narrative of the betrayed farmer against the corporate giant. The public will eat it up. I don't care about public opinion, Lysander. I corrected him, my voice sharper than I intended. I care about justice. And taking back what he stole. He met my gaze, a flicker of something akin to understanding in his eyes. Understood. We won't be suing for damages, Kalen. We'll be dismantling his empire, piece by piece, until the Thorne Business Campus is nothing but a monument to his downfall. That was the plan, a multi-pronged assault. Lysander would handle the legal and regulatory fronts, leveraging the mountain of evidence to trigger investigations, challenge permits, and expose the systemic corruption that allowed Thorne Development Group to flourish. My role, now, was to be the architect of the campaign, providing the intelligence, guiding the strategy, and funding the war. The first volley was subtle, almost imperceptible to the outside world, but it was designed to prick Silas Thorne. Lysander's firm, under a series of carefully constructed shell companies and anonymous benefactors, all funded by my war chest, began quietly acquiring small, strategic parcels of land adjacent to Thorne's new solar farm project in Oakhaven Creek. These weren't large enough to halt the project, but they were critical access points, easements, and buffer zones. Land that Thorne had overlooked or dismissed as insignificant now suddenly belonged to a mystery entity that refused to sell. Simultaneously, a series of anonymous tips, laced with highly specific, verifiable data, began to reach local environmental agencies and zoning boards. Concerns about water runoff, soil contamination, and potential impacts on local wildlife populations were raised, forcing Thorne Development Group to dedicate resources to answering these queries, conducting new studies, and facing unexpected delays. The details were so granular, so accurate, that they couldn't be dismissed as mere nuisance complaints. Someone knew exactly where to look. Silas Thorne, at first, wouldn't have even noticed. These were minor irritations, the kind of bureaucratic hurdles a company of his size routinely encountered. He had teams for this, an army of lawyers and PR people. He'd probably dismiss them as local NIMBYs or rival developers trying to slow him down. He wouldn't suspect Kalen Finch, the broken farmer, the man he'd erased from memory. I kept Reese and Alara's family out of the details of the war. I still lived a comfortable, though intentionally understated, life. I managed my investments, spent time with my grandchildren, watched Alara excel in her law career, and cherished the quiet moments with Reese. But beneath that placid surface, the engine of revenge was roaring. Reese, however, was not easily fooled. One evening, she found me in my study, a map of Oakhaven Creek spread across my desk, marked with intricate circles and arrows. My finger traced the outline of what used to be our homestead, now a concrete blight. "Kalen," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of years. "You're back in Oakhaven Creek, aren't you? Not physically, but in your mind." I looked up, meeting her gaze. Her eyes, though lined with age, still held that piercing intuition. "He's doing it again, Reese. The solar farm. He's taking advantage of other families, just like us." She came closer, placing a hand on my shoulder. "And this time, you're not going to let him." It wasn't a question. It was an affirmation, laced with familiar concern. "You've spent so long building yourself up, Kalen. Don't let him consume you." "He already did, Reese," I replied, my voice hoarse. 50 years ago. This is about reclaiming what he took, not just from us, but from the land, from the idea of justice itself. She squeezed my shoulder. "Just be careful, my love. Don't lose yourself in the fight." Her support, even with her reservations, was the last flicker of light I needed to ensure I wasn't just consumed by pure hatred. It was for her, for Alara, for Finn and Solara, that I fought. For the future, yes, but also for the past, to mend the broken legacy. The first significant ripple reached Thorne Development Group when one of their key permits for the Oakhaven Creek Solar Farm was inexplicably delayed by the state's Environmental Protection Agency. The agency cited an unprecedented volume of highly detailed, expert-backed concerns regarding hydrological impacts and potential harm to protected wetland species, all submitted by concerned citizens and non-profit environmental groups that had mysteriously sprung up. Lysander was a master at creating these paper tigers. Silas Thorne's operations director, a man named Sterling Vance, initially dismissed it, but the delays mounted. Contractors were idling, equipment sat unused, and the project schedule, along with its associated federal grant deadlines, began to slip. That's when emails started appearing in my inbox, forwarded by Lysander's team, internal communications from Thorne Development Group. Thorne was getting annoyed. He was demanding answers. "Find out who's behind this." One email, clearly from Silas himself, fumed. "I don't care if it's a bunch of tree-hugging hippies or a rival. Squash it. Now." This was the opening I needed. Lysander, armed with my intelligence, initiated a series of Freedom of Information Act requests, targeting every permit, every waiver, every public record related to Thorne's Oakhaven Creek project, and then broadened it to his other ventures. The sheer volume of these requests, all perfectly legal, all meticulously crafted, started to overwhelm local and state agencies, slowing down all of Thorne's projects. It was a bureaucratic siege. Then came the financial pressure. Leveraging my deep understanding of Thorne's investment portfolio and his reliance on specific lines of credit, Lysander began to quietly spread rumors, backed by carefully leaked, albeit sanitized, versions of my own incriminating data to financial institutions. These rumors hinted at undisclosed liabilities, regulatory violations, and impending lawsuits. Nothing concrete enough for a libel suit, but enough to make banks nervous. Loan officers, already wary of the mounting delays on the Oakhaven Creek project, began to scrutinize Thorne Development Group's creditworthiness with an intensity they hadn't before. The calls from Silas Thorne's office to Lysander's firm started, initially veiled as inquiries, then becoming more aggressive. Lysander, playing the innocent, always directed them to the various concerned citizens and environmental groups. Finally, a direct challenge. Thorne's lead attorney sent a strongly worded cease and desist letter to one of the shell nonprofits Lysander had created, threatening legal action for frivolous and malicious interference with business operations. It was a fishing expedition, a desperate attempt to unmask the puppet master. Lysander forwarded it to me with a single line. "He's feeling the bite, Kalen." I smiled, a cold, humorless expression that barely touched my eyes. The old Kalen Finch would have recoiled from such tactics. The new Kalen Finch embraced them. This was the language Silas Thorne understood: power, money, and pressure. The next step was to go public. Not with the full story of my personal revenge, not yet, but with a carefully curated expose. We had been feeding information to an investigative journalist named Seraphina Vance, Sterling Vance's sister, ironically enough, though she operated with fiercely independent integrity. She'd been digging into Thorne Development Group for years, frustrated by the lack of concrete evidence that could stand up in court. My data was her goldmine. She published her first major article in a widely read regional business magazine, Thorne Development Group, Visionary or Vulture, a deep dive into their sustainable practices. The article didn't mention the Finch homestead directly, but meticulously detailed the pattern of undervalued land acquisitions in economically vulnerable areas, the questionable environmental impact reports, the cozy relationships with local permitting offices, and the use of convoluted corporate structures to avoid accountability. It focused heavily on the mounting delays and environmental concerns surrounding the Oakhaven Creek Solar Farm, drawing direct parallels to past Thorne projects that had left communities with more promises than prosperity. The article hit like a bombshell. It confirmed what many suspected, giving it a legitimate journalistic voice. Investors started asking questions. Activist groups, real ones this time, began to organize. Local politicians, who had once welcomed Thorne with open arms, suddenly found themselves on the defensive. The phone in Lysander's office was ringing off the hook. He sent me an email, terse and to point. "Silas Thorne himself just called. He wants to know who you are, Kalen. He wants to know who is coming after him." I felt a surge of grim satisfaction. He remembered my name. He remembered me. The half-century of silence had broken, and the sound of it was the clatter of his empire beginning to shake. But I wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. This was just the opening salvo. The true battle, the direct confrontation, was yet to come. I knew Silas Thorne would roll over. He would fight back viciously, with every weapon at his disposal. He was a cornered animal, and he was dangerous. I sat at my desk, the glow of the city lights reflecting in the window, thinking of the barren fields, the leveled oak, the endless concrete. I thought of Alara's innocent questions, Reese's quiet strength, and I thought of Silas Thorne, undoubtedly fuming in his opulent office, realizing that someone was finally unraveling his carefully constructed web. My phone rang. It was Lysander. "Kalen, I just got off the phone with Thorne's personal lawyer. He threatened to sue every single entity we've created, and me personally, into oblivion. He also mentioned something disturbing." My grip tightened on the phone. "What is it?" He said. Lysander's voice was grim. "That Silas Thorne remembers the Finch homestead. And he remembers you. He specifically told me to relay a message. Tell Kalen Finch that some things, once taken, stay taken. And if he continues this foolishness, he'll lose far more than he did the first time." A cold dread coiled in my stomach, not for myself, but for my family. He was threatening Reese, Ilara, Finn, Solara. He was threatening the very people I was fighting to protect. But then, an even colder anger surged through me, eclipsing the fear. He had just confirmed it. He hadn't forgotten. He knew. And now, he had made it personal again, not just about the land, but about the lives I held dear. The game had just changed. It was no longer a war of documents and corporate maneuvers. It was a war of wills, a personal vendetta, and Silas Thorne had just drawn a line in the sand, daring me to cross it. And I would cross it, and I would burn his world down around him. The threat against my family was a jolt, a cold splash of ice water that cleared away any lingering hesitation. Silas Thorne had crossed a line, and now, so would I. For 50 years, I had moved in the shadows, a ghost in the machine, manipulating the strings of his downfall. But if he dared to touch Reese or Alara or my grandchildren, Finn and Solara, then the game of subterfuge was over. It was time for a face-to-face. It was time for Silas Thorne to look into the eyes of the man he'd ruined and understand that his reckoning had arrived. "He's threatened my family, Lysander," I stated, my voice flat, devoid of the tremor fear that had initially gripped me. We were on a secure video call. Lysander's face grim on my monitor. Lysander's brow furrowed. "That changes the calculus, Kalen. We need to consider their security. Perhaps a safe house, round-the-clock protection." "No." I cut him off, my voice steely. "This isn't about hiding. This is about ending him. He made it personal, and now I will too. We expose him, Lysander. All of it. The whole sordid truth. The Finch homestead, the predatory loan, the hailstorm, the land he stole and desecrated. We put my story, our story, front and center." Lysander leaned back, a calculating glint in his eyes. "It's a high-risk strategy, Kalen. He'll fight back with everything he has, legally and otherwise. He'll try to discredit you, tear apart your reputation. It will be messy, ugly." "Let it be ugly," I said, my gaze unwavering. "I've lived with ugly for 50 years. What's important is that he knows who is doing this, that he knows the farmer he crushed is the one tearing down his empire, brick by brick." Lysander nodded slowly. "Understood. We initiate Phase 3, the full-scale media offensive, leveraging Seraphina Vance's established credibility. And we prepare the grounds for a massive class-action lawsuit, not just against Thorne Development Group, but against Silas Thorne personally for fraud and racketeering. The evidence you amassed on his pattern of predatory acquisitions across multiple states will be damning. We'll seek to freeze his assets, dismantle his corporate structure, and ensure he faces not just financial ruin, but criminal investigation. The next few weeks were a maelstrom. Seraphina Vance, fueled by the full story and the depth of my evidence, published her next piece. This time, it wasn't just an expose of questionable business practices. It was a human story, a brutal recounting of the Finch homestead's downfall. She detailed Silas Thorne's arrival, the deceptive promises, the manipulated loan, the triggered acceleration clause, the timing of the freak hailstorm, and the transformation of a vibrant family farm into a soulless industrial park. She painted a stark picture of Kalen Finch, the innocent farmer, betrayed and dispossessed. She didn't name me explicitly at first, referring to me as the elderly former landowner, but the details were too specific, too raw, to be anything but true. The article went viral, picked up by national news outlets hungry for a David versus Goliath narrative. The public outcry was immediate and furious. People shared their own stories of corporate exploitation. Environmental groups, now fully engaged, amplified the story, demanding investigations into Thorne's environmental impact statements. Local communities targeted by Thorne's other projects, emboldened by the spotlight, began organizing protests and filing their own complaints. Thorne development groups' stock plummeted. Investors, already wary from the earlier rumors and regulatory delays, began a mass exodus. Banks, now facing public pressure and increasing legal scrutiny, froze Thorne's lines of credit. Construction on the Oak Haven Creek solar farm ground to a complete halt. Its unfinished skeleton a stark monument to Thorne's ambition and my quiet war. Silas Thorne's response was predictable. A furious denial, a PR blitz accusing me, still unnamed, of being a disgruntled, unstable old man fabricating a revenge fantasy. He threatened Seraphina Vance and her publication with libel suits, issued cease and desist orders against every activist group, and tried to muscle his way out of the burgeoning crisis. But the evidence was too overwhelming, too meticulously documented. Every denial was met with another damning revelation from Lysander's team, carefully leaked to journalists and regulatory bodies. Then came the public reveal. Lysander scheduled a press conference in Louisville, announcing the filing of the class action lawsuit. He stood before a phalanx of cameras, reporters, and a shocked audience, and then he introduced me. 50 years ago, I began, my voice clear and steady, amplified by the microphones. My name was Kalen Finch. I was a farmer, My family had worked our land in Oakhaven Creek, Kentucky, for generations. Then a man named Silas Thorne came. He promised help. He delivered ruin. I told my story not with anger, but with a quiet, devastating factualness. I spoke of Reese, of Alera, of the loss, the struggle, the slow, agonizing climb back. I held up copies of the original predatory loan documents, the manipulated appraisal reports, the permits for the industrial park that now stood on my ancestral land. I detailed the systemic abuse of power, the calculated destruction of livelihoods, the environmental negligence. When I finished, the silence in the room was profound, broken only by the rapid-fire clicks of cameras. I looked directly into the lens of the nearest camera, knowing Silas Thorne would be watching. "Silas," I said, my voice dropping to a low, chilling register, "you stole my land. You stole my family's legacy. You erased my past. But you didn't erase me. And now I'm here to collect." The reaction was explosive. The story of Kalen Finch, the farmer who waited 50 years for revenge, became a national sensation. Support poured in, legal aid offered, donations made to cover court costs. Though my personal war chest made them unnecessary, I allowed it for the optics. More importantly, the full weight of the law, spurred by public outrage, began to move. Regulatory bodies launched full-scale investigations into Thorne Development Group's practices across multiple states. State attorneys general announced inquiries into potential criminal fraud and environmental violations. The class action lawsuit, spearheaded by Lysander, grew exponentially, drawing in dozens of other families and communities wronged by Thorne. Silas Thorne, cornered and exposed, lashed out. He initiated a countersuit against me, accusing me of defamation, emotional distress, and corporate sabotage. He hired high-powered PR firms to paint me as a deranged opportunist. He even sent private investigators to dig into my past, hoping to find skeletons that would discredit my narrative. But I had lived a clean life, meticulously building my wealth and reputation in the open, leaving no exploitable weaknesses. His attempts only highlighted his desperation and malice. The revenge payoff was a slow, agonizing dismemberment of everything Silas Thorne held dear. The legal battles were brutal, but Lysander, armed with my 50 years of intelligence, tore through Thorne's defenses like a surgeon. We exposed a network of shell corporations designed to hide assets and liabilities, revealing a pattern of fraudulent accounting practices. We brought forward expert testimony that meticulously detailed the environmental damage caused by Thorne's projects, including the Thorne Business Campus on my old land, which was found to have significant unaddressed runoff and soil contamination issues from its construction. The final blow came in the form of a sweeping court judgment. Thorne Development Group was found liable for massive damages in the class action lawsuit, far exceeding its remaining assets. Regulatory fines piled up, amounting to hundreds of millions. More significantly, the court ordered the liquidation of Thorne Development Group, including all its assets, to satisfy the judgments and penalties. Silas Thorne himself was held personally liable for a substantial portion of the debt, effectively stripping him of his personal fortune. He was barred from ever holding a corporate directorship again, his reputation utterly in tatters. But it wasn't enough to just destroy his company. I wanted him to see it. Lysander arranged for a final, closed-door meeting in the court chambers, just before the public announcement of the judgment. It was just Silas Thorne, his now haggard legal team, Lysander, and me. Silas Thorne looked utterly defeated. The bespoke suits were still there, but they hung loosely on his frame. His once smooth face was etched with lines of stress and fury. His eyes, once predatory, now held a flicker of something close to terror. "Kalen Finch," he spat, his voice hoarse, devoid of its former silken charm. "You've ruined me. 50 years. You held on to this for 50 years? You're insane." I met his gaze, my own eyes calm and steady. "You took everything from me, Silas. My land, my legacy, my family's peace. You desecrated generations of my ancestors' work. You thought I was just a simple farmer. You thought I would just disappear. What did you want?" he snarled, desperation creeping into his voice. "Money? I could have given you money. Why this scorched earth? Money can't buy back what you took." I replied, a chillingly placid smile gracing my lips. Money can't buy back a family's history. Money can't buy back dignity. I wanted you to lose everything, Silas, exactly as you made me lose everything. I wanted you to understand what it feels like to be utterly stripped bare, with the whole world watching. Lysander then presented the final document, the one that would truly break Silas. Mr. Thorne, as part of the liquidation of Thorne Development Group, and to satisfy a portion of the environmental remediation requirements, the court has ordered the sale of the Thorne Business Campus in Oakhaven Creek. My client, Kalen Finch, through a newly formed nonprofit organization dedicated to sustainable land management, has submitted the winning bid. Silas Thorne's eyes widened in horror. My campus? You bought it? You can't. That's mine. It was never yours, Silas. I corrected him softly. It was always ours. You just borrowed it for 50 years. Now it comes home. The color drained from his face. He staggered back, leaning heavily on his lawyer's arm. The finality of it, the absolute, undeniable defeat, was more potent than any prison sentence. He hadn't just lost his wealth. He had lost the very symbol of his conquest of the man he had conquered. The court's judgment was publicly announced, and Silas Thorne's downfall was complete. He faced massive fines, legal disbarment, and the shame of a public trial for his more egregious criminal acts. He was a pariah, stripped of his empire, his fortune, and his freedom. He died a few years later in prison, a bitter, broken man, his name synonymous with corporate greed and environmental destruction. The Thorne Business Campus was mine again. The irony was almost overwhelming. The concrete warehouses, the paved-over fields, the leveled ancient oak. It was a scar on the landscape, a painful reminder of what had been. But now, it was a scar that could finally begin to heal. My nonprofit, named the Finch Legacy Foundation, didn't immediately tear down the structures. Instead, we embarked on a long-term plan of environmental remediation and revitalization. The contaminated soil was painstakingly cleaned. The concrete was broken up and recycled, and beneath it, we began to uncover the red Kentucky earth, reclaiming it inch by arduous inch. We planted thousands of new trees, including a new grove of oaks where the ancient one once stood, not to replace it, but to begin a new legacy. We didn't turn it back into a tobacco farm. The world had changed. Instead, we established a Center for Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education, focusing on drought-resistant crops, soil regeneration, and ecological restoration. We built community gardens, established nature trails, and created a peaceful public park where families could once again connect with the land. The spirit of the Finch homestead, the respect for the earth, lived on, transformed but not extinguished. I was an old man now, my hair pure white, my steps slower. Reese, my steadfast anchor, walked hand in hand with me through the revitalized grounds. Her eyes, though still carrying the shadow of the past, now held a renewed light. Ilara, a respected lawyer in her own right, became a board member of the Finch Legacy Foundation, ensuring its future. My grandchildren, Finn and Solara, ran through the young groves, their laughter echoing where once only the hum of industry had been. They learned about the land, about resilience, about the importance of fighting for what is right. I had achieved my revenge. Silas Thorne was destroyed, his memory tainted, his empire crumbled, and I had reclaimed the land, transforming the symbol of his greed into a beacon of hope and restoration. But the chilling resolution was this. The victory, while profound, didn't erase the 50 years of waiting, the decades of simmering anger, the relentless focus that had consumed so much of my life. I had become a different man, hardened, calculating, capable of a ruthless ambition that would have shocked the young farmer who once walked these fields. The satisfaction was deep, undeniable, a profound sense of justice finally served. But there was also a quiet weariness, a knowledge that the path of revenge, however justified, leaves indelible marks on the soul. Sometimes, when I stood on the highest point of the reclaimed land, looking out over the flourishing gardens and the newly planted forests, I would close my eyes and, for a fleeting moment, I could still smell the rich, loamy earth of the Finch homestead after a spring rain, mingle with the sweet, musky scent of ripening heirloom tobacco. It was a scent of life, of generations rooted deep in the red Kentucky soil of Oak Haven Creek. And it was mine once more, the end.